What is it?
I have you to thank for it. For the first time in my life, when confronted with a horrible, insensitive person, I knew exactly what I wanted to say, and I said it.
Meg Ryan spent most of the 1990s being the woman America trusted with its emotions. She was on posters, on magazine covers, on screens in films that made people feel genuinely good about love. She earned $15 million a picture at a time when almost no actress in Hollywood could say the same. And then one photograph, taken outside a party in the summer of 2000, changed the entire story. Not because of what it proved, but because of what the public decided it meant. What followed was over 2 decades of a narrative that Meg Ryan largely refused to correct until recently. And what she actually said is not what most people expected. What actually happened with Russell Crowe. Proof of Life was not the kind of film Meg Ryan typically made. It was an action thriller about a hostage negotiator. Tense, location-heavy, shot in difficult conditions. Crowe played the negotiator. Ryan played a woman whose husband had been taken. The film required them to spend significant time together on set, across an extended shoot, in circumstances that were physically and emotionally demanding, in ways that a romantic comedy on a studio lot in Los Angeles simply wasn't. Crowe, by 2000, was at a specific and volatile point in his own career. Gladiator would win him the Academy Award for Best Actor that same year. He had a reputation for intensity, for impatience, for saying things in interviews that publicists spent weeks cleaning up after. He was also, according to people who worked closely with him, genuinely magnetic in the way that certain performers are in person. A quality that doesn't always translate cleanly through a screen, but is difficult to be around without noticing. The relationship between Ryan and Crowe developed during production. People on the set described a connection that moved from professional to something more personal in a way that those things tend to happen on location shoots. Gradually, then suddenly. By the time they were seen in London during filming, the relationship was visible to anyone paying attention. They were spotted in restaurants and around the city in ways that made their connection obvious to observers even before any photographs were published. The hand-holding image from the Mission Impossible 2 party in July of 2000 was not the beginning of the relationship. It was simply the moment the public caught up with something that had been in progress for months. By that point, Ryan's marriage had already been announced as over. The relationship lasted less than a year. By Christmas of 2000, they were on different continents. Ryan in Los Angeles, Crowe back in Australia. The breakup happened without public statements or dramatic confrontations. They simply moved in different directions, and the relationship ended. What emerged in the years afterward, through a combination of reported accounts and Crowe's own public comments, suggested that the dynamic between them had been considerably more asymmetrical than the tabloid version allowed for. People close to Ryan described Crowe as intensely invested, pursuing the relationship with a degree of seriousness and urgency that she hadn't been prepared for, given where she was personally at the time. He gave her substantial gifts. He talked, according to those accounts, about wanting a future together in concrete terms that Ryan found overwhelming when she was still in the immediate aftermath of a difficult divorce. Crowe himself later said publicly that the geographic reality, his deep connection to Australia, his need to be rooted in that place, was something that ultimately couldn't coexist with the shape of Ryan's life in Los Angeles. He described it not as a failure, but as a collision between two people with incompatible logistical realities. He also said, in the same context, that he considered her a beautiful and courageous woman, and that losing her companionship had been a genuine loss, while being careful to distinguish between losing a romantic partner and losing a friendship. The warmth in how he discussed it, years afterward, was unambiguous. The director of Proof of Life, Taylor Hackford, had a different perspective. He was angry, and said so publicly, about the decision Ryan and Crowe made to largely avoid the press tour for the film. Both of them, in the immediate aftermath of the scandal breaking publicly, were unwilling to sit in front of journalists who would use a movie interview as a pretext to ask about their personal lives. Hackford felt that the film he had made suffered commercially as a result of that choice. He may have been right. Proof of Life did not perform at the level its budget or its cast might have suggested. But the decision Ryan and Crowe made to protect themselves rather than promote the film was also the decision of two people who understood exactly how those press conversations were going to go. Everything that came apart after. The Russell-Crowe relationship ended by the close of 2000. What came after it was a different kind of problem, one that unfolded over several years and left marks that were, in some respects, deeper than the scandal itself. Ryan had built her career on a specific kind of audience trust. People went to her films because they believed in her, not just as an actress, but as a person. The characters she had played across a decade of romantic comedies were warm, flawed, recognizably human, and always capable of being loved. That trust was transactional in a specific way. Audiences gave it freely, and in return, she gave them films that didn't betray it. When the tabloid version of the affair established itself as the dominant narrative, it didn't just damage her reputation. It damaged the mechanism through which her career had functioned. Audiences who had trusted her felt, in some hard-to-articulate way, that she had been hiding something, that the warmth had been a performance, that the real Meg Ryan was someone less straightforward than the person they had watched fall in love on screen for 10 years. She tried to reposition. In 2003, she appeared in the Cut, a film directed by Jane Campion, dark and sexually explicit, a deliberate departure from everything her career had been built on. It was not a calculated commercial move. It was the choice of an actress who wanted to demonstrate range and who was, by that point, operating with less concern for what the audience would accept and more concern for what interested her as a performer. The film was a commercial failure, grossing around $23 million worldwide against its production costs. The press appearance she made in London to promote that film produced what became one of the more talked-about interview moments of the decade. Sitting across from one of Britain's most prominent television hosts, Ryan encountered a line of questioning she had not anticipated, pointed, personal, and structured around the presumption that her decision to make a darker film was some kind of psychological symptom of the years she had just lived through. She responded with visible discomfort, short answers, and eventually a request to simply end the exchange. The host, at the time, characterized her behavior as rude and dismissive. The British press agreed enthusiastically. She was described as arrogant, sullen, and contemptuous of the people who had come to watch her. Years later, the host who had conducted that interview said publicly that he had behaved badly. He acknowledged that he had been angry with her in a way that was not his place, that he had come across as pompous, and that he owed her an apology. He stopped short of a full, unqualified one, adding that she had played some part in how things went, but the acknowledgement was significant. The person who had been described as the villain of that exchange was acknowledging, a decade and a half after the fact, that he had contributed to it. Ryan's response to that admission, when asked about it later, was measured. She said she hadn't spent time thinking about him. She had left after the interview and not looked back. That was the posture she had adopted across the entire period. Not engagement, not public correction, not the kind of media rehabilitation campaign that a publicist might have designed. Just distance. Her next film, Against the Ropes, opened in 2004 to $3 million in its first weekend. The woman who had commanded $15 million per film was watching her work disappear from theaters in under a week. She took an extended break from the industry. She told a journalist that she had felt burned out, that she had reached a point where her own life felt like something she was watching from behind glass rather than actually living. She stepped back, not because Hollywood fired her, but because she had stopped wanting to participate in the version of it that was available to her. She adopted a daughter from China during this period, eventually named Daisy. She worked with an international poverty reduction organization focused on economic empowerment for women. She moved through the middle years of the 2000s and into the 2010s, largely outside the entertainment press's primary focus, which, given what the entertainment press's primary focus had done to her, was not an accident. The photograph that ended an era. Most careers don't collapse in a single moment. They erode, slowly, quietly, across a series of small decisions and unlucky turns. Meg Ryan's didn't erode. It broke. And it broke at a specific point in time that almost everyone who followed her story can identify without thinking too hard about it. July of 2000. Outside the premiere party for Mission Impossible 2, hosted by Tom Cruise. Two people emerged from the event, Meg Ryan and Russell Crowe, and photographers caught them holding hands. That image went everywhere. Within days, it had been printed in every major tabloid on 2 continents, dissected on television, and turned into the centerpiece of a story that the press had already decided it was going to tell. The story went like this. America's sweetheart had abandoned her husband and her marriage for a volatile, intense Australian actor. She had thrown away the life people had imagined for her, the romantic comedy version, the one where love worked out and the credits rolled at the right moment, in favor of something messier and less forgivable. She had, in the tabloid shorthand of the era, become someone else, someone the public wasn't sure it liked. What made the image so damaging wasn't just the hand-holding, it was the timing. Ryan's separation from Dennis Quaid had been announced the previous month. The divorce wasn't finalized, and here she was, before the ink had dried on the legal paperwork, photographed in public with her co-star. The press treated the photograph as confirmation of a sequence of events it had already constructed. Ryan had cheated. Ryan had caused the breakdown. Ryan was the problem. The coverage that followed was relentless in a way that feels almost quaint by today's standards. Pre-social media, pre-streaming, operating entirely through print and television, but was no less total for being analog. Columnists weighed in. Talk shows debated it. The woman who had spent a decade being described as the most likable actress in Hollywood was now being described as something considerably less flattering. What the coverage rarely examined was what Ryan's marriage had actually been before the photograph existed, or what kind of person Russell Crowe actually was off-screen, or whether the story the tabloids were telling had any real relationship to what had happened between these two people. Those questions got crowded out by the image, which was simpler and more satisfying than anything the actual facts were likely to produce. Ryan stayed mostly quiet. She gave a handful of interviews in the immediate aftermath, pushed back gently on a few of the more egregious claims, and then largely retreated from the kind of press engagement that had defined her career throughout the 90s. The silence was interpreted by a press that had already decided what it thought, as confirmation of guilt. It was neither. But understanding what it actually was requires going back further than that July photograph, back to where Ryan started, and back to what she had built before any of it came apart. $15 million and a ceiling she didn't know was there. The version of Meg Ryan that existed before 2000 is worth understanding in specific terms, because it makes what happened afterward considerably harder to explain away as simple career decline. She was born Margaret Hyra in November of 1961 in Fairfield, Connecticut. Her mother had been an actress and a teacher. Her father taught school. She took the stage name Ryan from her maternal grandmother's maiden name, a small decision that would eventually be recognized by audiences on 5 continents. She studied at the University of Connecticut, then transferred to New York University, and left 1 semester before graduating to pursue acting. That kind of risk, walking away from a degree that close to completion, tends to either pay off completely or fail completely. In her case, it paid off. Her first substantial television work came on the soap opera As the World Turns, where she worked from 1982 through 1984. It was training, not stardom, and she treated it that way. Her film breakthrough came with Top Gun in 1986. Not a leading role, but a culturally significant film that put her in front of an enormous audience and made directors and casting agents pay attention. 3 years later, she landed When Harry Met Sally. That film, released in 1989, is where Ryan's particular talent became fully visible. The script by Nora Ephron gave her a character of genuine complexity, funny and anxious and occasionally maddening, and Ryan played it with a kind of naturalism that looked easy and was not. She received her first Golden Globe nomination for it. The famous diner scene from that film became one of the most referenced moments in the history of American romantic comedy. It is still referenced. That tells you something about the quality of what she did there. The 1990s belonged to her in a way that almost no actress can claim about a decade. Sleepless in Seattle, French Kiss, You've Got Mail, the last two of which paired her again with Tom Hanks. And their chemistry across multiple films became a kind of cultural shorthand for a certain kind of on-screen romantic warmth that audiences kept returning to. Combined, 4 of her major romantic comedies from that period grossed over $670 million worldwide. Those are not the numbers of a performer whose appeal was niche or accidental. Those are the numbers of someone who had figured out something real about what audiences wanted to feel in a movie theater. She also pushed against the type when she felt like it. In 1994, she took on When a Man Loves a Woman, a dramatically heavier film about addiction that earned her a Screen Actors Guild nomination. She understood that the romantic comedy image, however profitable, was a box she'd been placed inside, and she spent parts of her career trying to work outside it. That tension between what audiences wanted from her and what she wanted from herself would eventually define the decisions she made around 2000, including taking on the film that put her on the same set as Russell Crowe. By the time she signed on to Proof of Life in 2000, she was earning $15 million per film. That figure requires context. In 2000, the highest-paid actors in Hollywood were almost uniformly male. The fact that Ryan had negotiated herself into that bracket, based entirely on her own box office record and the industry's recognition of her commercial value, represented something that very few actresses at any point in Hollywood history had managed to achieve. She had done it on the strength of 4 romantic comedies and a demonstrated ability to fill seats in theaters regardless of who else was in the film. She was also, by that point, in a marriage that had quietly become something very different from what had appeared in public. And that gap between the image and the reality is where the actual story of 2000 begins. The marriage the public never really saw. Dennis Quaid was not a minor figure when he and Meg Ryan began their relationship. He had appeared in The Right Stuff and other substantial films well before Ryan became a household name. When they met on the set of the 1987 film Inner Space, he was arguably the more recognizable of the two. Fame, as Quaid himself would later acknowledge, is not a stable condition. It shifts and redistributes in ways that are almost impossible to predict from inside a relationship. Their connection didn't become romantic during Inner Space. It clicked the following year. On the set of DOA, they began dating, and the relationship moved with the kind of urgency that tends to characterize pairings between people who both understand the specific pressures of the industry they're working inside. Plans to marry in 1990 were interrupted when Quaid disclosed to Ryan that he had been using illegal substance regularly, a confession that could have ended the relationship before the wedding happened. Instead, he went to treatment, he got clean, and they married on Valentine's Day in 1991. Their son, Jack Quaid, was born in April of 1992. Jack would later become an actor himself, appearing in the Hunger Games franchise and the television series The Boys, a career trajectory that, in retrospect, had fairly obvious origins in having grown up inside one of Hollywood's most recognized families. But the marriage, behind what the public could see, had problems that predated the Crowe situation by several years. Quade's struggles with addiction, though he had addressed them before the wedding, had done damage to the foundation of the relationship that sobriety alone didn't repair. He would later describe the extent of his illegal substance use during that period in terms that made clear it had not been a minor or occasional habit. The quantities involved were serious, and the effect on the people around him was real. There was also the fame asymmetry, which Quade discussed publicly years afterward with a candor that was notable for someone in his position. As Ryan's career accelerated through the 90s, the box office records, the magazine covers, the cultural ubiquity of her face and name, his did not keep pace at the same level. He continued working. He had a career, but walking down the street with Meg Ryan meant disappearing beside her in the public eye, and he admitted that he had found that difficult in ways he wasn't proud of. He described it as a growth opportunity in retrospect, but acknowledged that at the time it had felt like something closer to erasure. The separation was announced in June of 2000. Ryan later told a television interviewer that the marriage had not been a functioning relationship for a long time before it officially ended, that the dissolution of the marriage in any real sense had happened well before the press became aware of it. She said she should have left earlier. That framing of a marriage that had effectively ended before anyone outside it knew is central to understanding what the Russell Crowe situation actually was, versus what the tabloid version of it became. Quade's own account of the period after the separation described genuine emotional devastation. He used language about identity collapse, about the way the end of a long relationship doesn't just end the relationship, but requires a complete reconstruction of how you understand yourself. He said it felt like a kind of death. He was not performing bitterness. He was describing a real experience of loss. But that loss was the product of a marriage that had been struggling for years, not of a co-star who appeared on a film set at the wrong moment. The photograph at the Mission Impossible 2 party made it easier to assign cause and effect in a way that felt satisfying. Russell Crowe was the reason. Meg Ryan was the one who made it happen. It was a cleaner story than the truth, which is usually more complicated and considerably less dramatic. What she said when she finally stopped being quiet. The Meg Ryan, who eventually started speaking more openly about what had happened, was not the Meg Ryan who had stayed mostly silent through the height of the scandal. Something had shifted, not in terms of the facts, which had remained consistent, but in terms of what she was willing to say about them and what she thought the public deserved to know. She had touched on it in a television interview years earlier, telling an interviewer that her marriage had been unhealthy and that she should have ended it sooner. That was a significant admission, a quiet acknowledgement that the narrative of a happy marriage destroyed by an affair was not accurate. But it didn't generate the sustained attention it probably deserved, partly because it was framed carefully, and partly because the press had already moved on to other things. What changed by the time Ryan reached her mid-60s was a quality that she described in her own terms as arriving at a place where she said what she meant without worrying about how it was going to land. That kind of public frankness is unusual for someone with her particular history of press coverage, because the coverage had demonstrated clearly that speaking openly carried costs. She had been punished for behavior that was ambiguous, for choices that were personal, for a relationship that lasted less than a year. The lesson the press had tried to teach her was that openness invited more damage. She eventually stopped taking that lesson. In a 2024 interview with a British newspaper, she addressed the entire period with a directness that had been largely absent from her public posture for 2 decades. She talked about what it had felt like to be labeled a scarlet woman by a press and a public that had previously celebrated her. And the thing she said about it, which landed differently than most people expected, was that the experience had been liberating. Not comfortable, not easy, not something she would have chosen, but liberating in a specific and functional sense. When the worst thing that can happen to your public reputation has already happened, the fear of it happening loses its leverage over you. She stopped being afraid of what people thought, because the evidence was in that they were going to think what they wanted, regardless of the facts she could provide. She also recalled a specific moment, standing in a hotel lobby in London, feeling the room go quiet around her, every conversation stopping as people recognized her and stared. And instead of feeling diminished by it, she started laughing. Not performance, not bravado, just a genuine recognition that the disapproval of a room full of strangers had no actual power over her life. That shift, she said, was when something fundamental changed in how she moved through the world. Her assessment of the Russell-Crowe relationship itself, at this distance, was neither nostalgic nor bitter. She acknowledged that it had happened during a period of real personal turbulence, that she had been emerging from a long and difficult marriage, that the intensity of what developed on that film set had been real, and that the version of the story the press had told bore limited resemblance to what she had actually experienced. She was not interested in relitigating the details. She was interested in being accurate about what the experience had cost her and what it had unexpectedly given her. The cost was visible and documented. A career that had been at its commercial peak in 2000 was, by 2004, struggling to fill theaters on an opening weekend. The infrastructure of her professional life, the relationships with studios, the automatic assumption that a film with her name attached would perform, had been dismantled in a way that no amount of subsequent work fully rebuilt to the same level. She was clear-eyed about that. She didn't minimize it or reframe it as something other than what it was. What she had gained was harder to quantify and easier to dismiss, which is probably why it didn't make the same kind of headlines. She had found out what she was actually made of, what she could absorb and continue functioning through. She had discovered that the version of her career built on audience affection was more fragile than she had understood, but that she herself was considerably less fragile than the industry had assumed. She made a film in 2023, What Happens Later, that she co-wrote and directed on her own terms for an audience she wasn't trying to recover. She wasn't performing for the people who had left. She was working for herself. At 64, the silence she was breaking wasn't really about Russell Crowe. It was about a period of her life that had been narrated by people who weren't in it, interpreted by people who hadn't asked her, and used as evidence for conclusions that didn't fit the actual sequence of events. She was saying, with the specificity that comes from 20-plus years of distance and the confidence that comes from having survived the worst version of the story, that the narrative had been wrong, not wrong in every detail, but wrong in what it concluded. Wrong about who was responsible, wrong about what the marriage had been, wrong about what the affair meant, wrong, most importantly, about what kind of person it made her. The public had believed the photograph before it believed her. She wasn't particularly asking for a reversal. She was offering the correction for whoever wanted it, with or without the apology that was never really coming from anyone who owed her one. Meg Ryan spent 2 decades being the story other people told about her, and then, quietly, she started telling her own. The question worth leaving in the comments is this: when you look at everything that actually happened versus what the tabloids said happened, do you think Hollywood ever really gave her a fair shot at the truth? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.